Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. Now, have you ever read a story that seemed simple at first, but stayed with you like it was saying something deeper than it appeared to? Maybe it was a fable, a myth, or a parable. Humans have always done that. We wrap our biggest questions in stories. Now, picture life thousands of years ago. You don't have science, medicine, or history books. The sun rises, the rain falls, people live and die, but you don't know why. You just see the patterns and wonder what or who might be behind them. And that's where the earliest parts of the Bible come from. Not from a God handing down perfect answers, but from human beings do what humans do best, trying to understand. The people who wrote these texts were asking the same questions we still ask today about purpose, suffering, justice, and meaning. The Bible, in that sense, isn't a message from beyond. It's a message from within, from humans to humans. Our first great attempt to make sense of the world we found ourselves in. And that's what we're going to explore. Not only how the Bible was written by people, but how its parables, metaphors, and moral stories reveal the earliest stages of human thought, the moment we began to look at our world and ask, why? Picture life 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. You wake up with the sun because there are no clocks. The world around you feels alive in ways that are both beautiful and terrifying. You depend on the rain, the harvest, and the goodwill of your neighbors. The line between safety and disaster is thin. One bad season, one disease, one storm, and everything you love can be gone. When lightning splits the sky, you don't have weather reports to tell you what's coming. When illness spreads, you have no microscope to find the cause. Death arrives suddenly, and it feels personal. It feels aimed. And when something feels aimed, it's natural to imagine an archer. Without science or medicine, early humans used the tools they had: observation, memory, and imagination. They watched the sun rise and fall, the moon wax and wane, the tides pull back and return. They noticed patterns. They didn't yet know the mechanisms behind them. And so, to fill in the gaps, they told stories. Stories that tried to explain why things happened, not just how. And when we can't find reason, we often imagine a reasoner. The storm wasn't random, it was a god showing anger. The flood wasn't just bad luck, it was a punishment or a cleansing. When the crops were good, it meant the gods were pleased. When they failed, someone must have offended them. And this wasn't ignorance, it was ingenuity. Mythmaking was humanity's first science, our earliest form of psychology, sociology, and philosophy all at once. It gave people a way to connect their experiences to something larger, to organize the chaos of life into meaning. Think about it. If your village floods and you can't stop it or predict it, what's the next best thing? To tell a story that explains it. The story becomes a warning, a moral lesson, and a source of hope. Over time, those stories spread, merge, and evolve. And that's how mythologies form. You can see it everywhere in early cultures. In Mesopotamia, long before the Hebrew Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh told of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. In Hindu traditions, the story of Manu describes a man saved from a world-consuming deluge. Across the world, flood stories echo through Mesoamerican, African, and Pacific island cultures. Each tale reflects the same impulse: to make sense of disaster, to draw moral order out of chaos. Nature was not yet natural, it was personal. The sky could be angry, the earth could be vengeful, and survival depended on appeasing or understanding these unseen forces. So when we read the earliest parts of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms, we're not seeing divine instruction dropped into history. We're seeing our species thinking out loud. Human beings in the infancy of their understanding, looking at floods, droughts, disease, and death, and asking, why is this happening? What does it mean? Every explanation they gave was built from what they had available: observation, guesswork, memory, and imagination. Those tools give birth not just to myth, but to meaning, to moral lessons, shared identity, and the first organized attempt to explain the world. And that's where the Bible begins. Not with divine knowledge coming down from above, but with human curiosity reaching up from below. When we open a Bible today, it's easy to think of it as one unified book, perhaps even the direct voice of God. But in truth, it's more like an ancient library. Dozens of authors wrote its parts across hundreds of years in different places under very different circumstances. Some were poets, some were priests, others were political writers or storytellers. Their words came from the world they knew, one filled with kings and wars, droughts and famines, tribes and temples. Before any of it was written down, most of the stories were passed along by word of mouth. Parents told them to their children. Priests repeated them in rituals. Storytellers added local details that made sense to their own audience. Over generations, details shifted, merged, or slid apart. By the time they were finally written, they had already carried the fingerprints of countless human voices. The first chapters of Genesis are a perfect example. We don't get one creation story, we get two. In one, God creates humans last, both male and female together. In the other, Adam appears first, then the plants and the animals, and finally Eve. Those stories come from different traditions, stitched together by editors who wanted to preserve both rather than choose between them. That's why the Bible often contains contradictions, overlaps, and double versions of events. The flood story, the genealogies, even the laws of Moses, each reflect the hands of different writers, all trying to capture their people's understanding of the world and their relationship to what they thought was divine. But that was only the first stage of its evolution. Once the stories were written, they had to be copied, and every copy was done by hand. Scribes made small errors, adding clarifying notes, or smoothed out difficult passages. Over time, these changes accumulated. When scholars today compare ancient manuscripts, they find thousands of variations, missing lines, altered words, even added paragraphs. Some famous passages don't appear in the earliest versions at all, like the story of the woman caught in adultery, where Mr. Jesus says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." That story was added centuries later, yet became one of the most beloved in the New Testament. Then came translation. Every translation is also an interpretation. Translators had to decide which words carried the right meaning. The Hebrew word, often rendered virgin in Isaiah, for example, simply meant young woman. One choice of wording reshaped entire theological traditions. So when we read the Bible today, we're really reading a palimpsest, a text written over, revised, translated, and reinterpreted by humans for millennia. It's not a static message. It's a living record of how human beings have tried to understand existence, morality, and suffering. And if we look closely, we can see the social world behind the words. These were not modern societies. They were tribal, patriarchal, and often harsh. And their laws reflect that. Men owning wives, slavery as normal, foreigners distrusted, and wars carried out with divine justification. For their time, those rules made sense. They helped small, fragile communities survive. But they were never meant as timeless moral laws for all people everywhere. They show us what those people valued and feared, but not necessarily what we should value now. And that's what makes the Bible fascinating, not as a perfect revelation from above, but as a deeply human document from below. And by that I don't mean hell, I mean earth. A window into our ancestors' minds as they try to explain their world, find meaning into it, and to pass on lessons on how to live. It's a record of us at our most searching, most creative, and most uncertain. Why do stories stay with us long after we've forgotten the details? Because humans don't think in lists or equations, we think in stories. Narratives give shape to memory, emotion, and morality. They're how we remember lessons and share them. That's why so much of the Bible is storytelling. Whether it's myth, poetry, or parable, these are humans teaching through narrative. The goal wasn't just to record events, it was to explore questions that never stop being relevant. How should we treat each other? What does forgiveness look like? What happens when we lose our way? Take the parable of the Good Samaritan. In the story, a traveler is beaten and left for dead. Two respected men, a priest and a Levite, see him but pass by. Then a Samaritan, a member of a group despised by the audience, stops to help. The power of the story lies in the reversal. The hero isn't the righteous insider, but the rejected outsider. It's a challenge to empathy itself. Are you only kind to your own, or do you care for anyone in need? In its original context, this wasn't a soft moral tale. It was provocative. It forced listeners to imagine that virtue and compassion might come from someone they'd been taught to hate. Another story, The Prodigal Son, hits the same emotional core from a different angle. A reckless son wastes his inheritance and returns home in shame. He expects rejection, but instead his father runs to greet him, celebrating his return. The story holds a mirror to our own contradictions: mercy and resentment, pride and love, guilt and acceptance. We recognize ourselves in those stories because they're about people and not dogma. They work because they come from observation and imagination, our oldest tools for understanding one another. But not every story in the Bible is meant to be moral instruction in the same way. Some are metaphors that got mistaken for history. Ancient audiences often knew they were symbolic. The creation stories in Genesis, for instance, echo older Mesopotamian myths about chaos being shaped into order. They weren't answering specific scientific questions, they were answering existential ones. Why is there something rather than nothing? What's our place in it? The story of Jonah and the whale is another example. It's not a biological puzzle about how someone could live inside a fish. It's a psychological story about avoidance and change. Jonah runs from responsibility, is consumed by the consequences of his own choices, and emerges transformed. Whether it happened or not is besides the point. What matters is that we recognize ourselves in his struggle. When we turn these metaphors into literal claims about physics or biology, we drain them of their meaning. The power of the story lies in what it represents, not what it records. Literalism turns insight into argument. It replaces the moral with the mechanical. The Bible stories are valuable not because they're perfect, but because they're human. They reveal what our ancestors thought about kindness, guilt, justice, and redemption long before psychology, philosophy, or ethics had formal names. When we read them as products of human imagination, they don't lose any beauty, they gain it. Because then we see them for what they really are, some of the earliest evidence of people thinking seriously about what it means to live well. They're not divine commands from above, they're reflections from below. Again, I mean earth, not below that. Left behind by people asking the same questions we still ask today. When we read the Bible as a human document, we start to see something remarkable. Not perfection, but progress. These stories and teachings were our species' first draft of philosophy, science, and ethics. They were humanity's early effort to answer good questions we still ask. Why do bad things happen? What makes something right or wrong? Why are we here at all? But our ancestors were working with almost no reliable data. The world was mysterious, unpredictable, and often terrifying. They looked for patterns, and when they couldn't find them, they imagined them. When disease spread, it seemed moral. The sick must have sinned. The gods must be angry. Without microscopes or medicine, they explained infection through impurity, spiritual pollution rather than germs. Rituals of cleansing, sacrifice, and prayer were their best attempts at controlling something invisible. When the earth shook or the rivers flooded, it couldn't be just chance. It had to mean something. Maybe the gods were punishing arrogance or rewarding faith. That's how stories like the Great Flood or the destruction of Sodom emerged. Not as history, but as meaning-making. They weren't trying to deceive. They were trying to understand. They were asking, why is this happening? And the only language they had was myth. That's why the Bible contains contradictions and moral tension. One author is saying suffering is punishment, the other is saying it's a mystery only God can know. One passage blesses mercy, another commands slaughter. These aren't flaws in divine design, they're fingerprints of human confusion. But that confusion is what makes it valuable. These texts show us thinking in motion, people observing, guessing, revising, and trying to codify wisdom. They were wrong about the mechanisms, but right about the impulse, to explain, to understand, and to find order in chaos. The Bible is full of errors, but they're the kind of errors that mark the beginning of learning. It's humanity's rough draft of understanding reality. And like any first draft, it's messy, inconsistent, and sometimes troubling. But it's also the reason we ever learn to write better ones. When we stop treating the Bible as an infallible rulebook and start reading it as a human document, it doesn't shrink in meaning, it expands. We begin to see not divine perfection, but human depth, a record of our ancestors wrestling with the same questions we still ask today. Even if they got the details wrong, the age of the earth, the cause of disease, the structure of the cosmos, their stories still hold immense literary and moral value. They reveal how early humans thought about empathy, justice, and purpose. The Good Samaritan's compassion for a stranger, the prodigal son's plea for forgiveness, the Psalms of lament and praise, all show a civilization trying to teach what it means to be decent, even before we had modern ethics to name it. Viewed in this way, the Bible isn't just ancient theology, it's early psychology and social philosophy written in metaphor. It's how people made meaning before science and philosophy had formal methods. Studying it critically also trains a vital skill, discernment. We learn to ask, who wrote this? Who benefited from it? What assumptions shaped it? That kind of questioning doesn't destroy faith, it builds understanding. It's the foundation of all critical thought, the same impulse that led from myth to logic, from superstition to science. And as we trace how interpretation changes, how ancient laws once used to justify slavery are now read as moral failure, or how patriarchal norms are reinterpreted in the light of equality, we see humanity learning. The Bible becomes a timeline of our evolving conscience. Ultimately, reading the Bible as human works turns it into a mirror, not a monument. It reflects back everything that makes us human, our cruelty, our creativity, our longing to be better than what we are. Its value lies not in being divine, but in being ours. It reminds us that meaning is something we make, and that our ability to question, interpret, and grow may be the most sacred thing about us. So what do we find when we strip away the divine and look at the Bible as a human work? We find that it is human first. Flawed first, yes, but also imaginative first. It's a collection of stories written by people trying to make sense of life, death, morality, and mystery long before science or philosophy could lend them tools. Every parable, every law, every psalm is a record of that search. The ancients may not have understood biology or physics, but they understood something about longing, fear, and hope. The Good Samaritan's compassion, the psalmist's despair, the poet's plea for meaning, all of it speaks to our species learning how to think, how to feel, and how to live together. To see the Bible as human is not to dismiss it. It's to appreciate it more deeply. It's to recognize the courage it took for our ancestors to face a vast and often terrifying world and try to write meaning into it. They didn't have revelation, they had imagination. And imagination is what got us here. If we can see the Bible not as a divine manual, but as humanity reaching towards understanding, then perhaps we can look at all of our ideas the same way, with curiosity instead of certainty, with wonder instead of worship. Because in the end, the Bible's lasting lesson isn't about a God who speaks to man, it's about humans who dare to speak to the universe, and in doing so, begin the long conversation that still continues in us today. So thanks for checking this educational portion out today. If you like this kind of content, show me I should be making more by hitting that like button. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to get more content like this delivered directly to your YouTubes. Special thanks goes out to all of my wonderful patrons, especially Clanimus, Anima, and Sora, who are the greatest of stories that make up the entire bibliography that is my channel. If you would like to enter the Dark of All Trades mythos, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. These educational topics are a lot of fun for me to talk about. I can just sit and write the script with all of my thoughts and go back and edit later to make sure I'm saying things exactly how I want to. It's a lot of work, but the fact that you all enjoy what I do brings a smile to my cartoon face. Thank you. And as always, keep learning.